These are all of my best videos on arrangement in one place, so you can learn how to make your productions stand out more, have more clarity, and be 10 times easier to mix. These lessons have reached nearly 1 million producers all over the world. And I believe that arrangement is one of the most important topics in all of music production, but is also one of the least talked about topics in YouTube in all of music production. So if you're ready to radically improve your own productions, your own arrangements, strap in, let's get started. Arranging is one of the most important aspects of producing great music, and if you are not answering these 3 questions properly, then you pretty much will be stuck with really boring arrangements. What, when, and doing what? Arrangement is, at its core, answering these 3 questions. So if you want to be better at arranging, then you need to simplify what arrangement is in the first place. Arrangement is ultimately all about making musical decisions in time, and these 3 questions are the focus. What is the instrument? When is it happening? And what is it doing? If you can answer these 3 questions in a way that's really compelling, then you're way more likely to have arrangements that will hook your audience and keep them interested. Now, obviously, there's more to hooking your audience than just this. I need to make sure you understand that this is just one piece of the bigger puzzle. You still need killer sounds, killer performances, a killer mix, and all that jazz. But if you have all those things and then have a really boring arrangement, then those things really don't matter in the first place. So let's tackle these questions, because you don't just answer one question at a time. You have to work all 3 questions together when you're making decisions. So what is the instrument? That's pretty straightforward. What is the sound that you're actually using? When in time does this sound occur? Is this the intro, the verse, the chorus, the bridge? And then that third question, what is the instrument actually doing? Is it sustained, just doing chords? Is it melodic? Is it plucked? Is it rhythmic? In other words, what is that articulation? And then what is the pattern that it's playing? I think you get the idea. So now that you know the questions, let's dig into how to wield these questions to create better arrangements, because knowing the questions isn't the same thing as knowing how to answer them effectively and creatively. The first thing is that variety is a good thing. If you're constantly answering these questions with the same answers, then you'll end up with something pretty bland. Now, here's just an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say you have a song that is completely piano-led. So we'll go with something very simple. It's just playing sustained chords. So the what, that first question, is piano. When? The whole song, right? This is the whole song. What is it doing? Sustained chords. We've now answered those 3 questions, but that final question is just sustained chords for the whole song. If it's doing that exact same thing throughout the whole song, then that's not creating variety or variation. Instead, that begins to sound like a loop over and over, which listeners are going to feel bored with after a bit. So instead, if we want the piano through the whole song, which is fine, then a good arranger is going to find more ways to creatively answer that final question of what is it doing. So instead of looping that same thing over and over, the goal is to find ways to manipulate and modify what that piano part is doing over time to make that arrangement and in turn make the song feel more interesting. So you tell me, if I play a chord progression on the piano and just keep doing it over and over, how long before you get bored? By now, I'm already bored. So I think you get the idea. If I just keep doing that over and over and over again, that's not very interesting. But what if instead I started with that sustained concept, and then the second time where I repeat that chord progression, I begin to change and manipulate that sound like this. I think we can all agree that sounds more interesting, but all I've done is simply modified that final question of what is it doing? Now, in the grand scheme of a total song, you might not want to change it every single repetition of that chord progression. I'm trying to more or less give you a conceptual idea of what I mean by modifying or varying. Instead of constantly answering that question the same, we need to have some variety. Now, let me just pause and say that there are times when repetition is a good thing. So I want to be really clear that I'm not saying that you need to change things every single moment. You need to use musicality and creative judgment when you're doing this. I hope you understand that what I'm trying to convey is a concept that you can apply about 1,000 different ways. If we have a piano-led piece of music, we can still have a wildly interesting arrangement. So don't think that arrangement is just changing the instruments. Like, sure, that can be a part of it, but it's certainly possible to have a really great arrangement with simple instrumentation. But with that said, changing instrumentation is a great way to introduce fascination and change within the context of a song and an arrangement. Let's take a look at how we can do that. And that's by simply just changing the answer to some of these questions. That first question of what is it, for example, is gonna be a big one. So in this piano-led song, we would start with that piano, and then over time we can introduce these new elements, new instruments, new sounds that have a whole new set of these 3 questions to answer. So this is really important. For every new instrument that you introduce, you have to re-answer these 3 questions. So if you simplify it down to this, then you can start to build complex arrangements in a way that doesn't feel random, but is more strategic. When I'm building big sounding arrangements, I'm asking these questions mentally. And the more you do this, the more you can do it without having to consciously think about it. It becomes natural, a bit like riding a bike. You just start to do it because you know this is how it goes. So we have piano, and then maybe I add in some guitar or some drums or some strings, and each new element I add comes with that new set of these 3 questions. So when you're laying out an arrangement, you can really think of it like taking a piece of paper and writing out each section of your song and literally conceptually making decisions about what you want to have happen. By writing it out, you can actually step back and zoom out. Let's just say that the intro is just piano and it's sustained chords. Great, we've just answered those 3 questions, right? It's piano, it's in the verse, and it's just playing sustained chords. Now verse 1, we can add, acoustic guitar, right? And it's now a light finger-picked pattern, and it's also adding in some mellow electric piano doing a soft chord pattern, for example. So you see, by doing this, I've actually answered these 3 questions with each of those elements. What is it? It's acoustic guitar. When? Verse 1. What is it doing? Finger-pick pattern. And then we did the same thing with that electric piano. I hope this is making sense to you. And from here, we don't let this become stifling. In other words, when you actually start producing something, creative ideas hit, things happen, things change. This is more of a guide than anything to help you make good decisions that aren't just identical. Because if you're just making music and you're going about and you're like, all right, cool, I got the electric piano, chords, guitar, chords, everything's now doing the same thing. So if you just map it out, now we actually have a plan. But don't be afraid to let creativity guide you and make changes and do things differently. So this is not a rule or a set in stone kind of thing. And again, there's like 1,000 ways of doing this. Think of all the different articulations these different instruments can do, all the different patterns you can do, and stop thinking about it just as far as everything doing the same thing. Instead, start thinking, how can we actually kind of interplay these things and weave them together to create something interesting over time. So if I have verse 1, sustained piano, I probably don't want sustained piano in verse 2. If I have the finger-picked guitar in verse 1, maybe verse 2 we go to just a strumming pattern or a palm mute pattern. I hope you're understanding that you want things manipulating and changing throughout the entirety of that song. And by answering these questions different from section to section to section makes it more interesting. I'm going to share with you how pro producers approach producing in such a way that makes mixing 10 times easier. And it's probably not what you think. I'm going to do this by showing you a production that I co-produced and co-wrote with a buddy of mine, Forrest Whitehead, who also has a couple of Grammy nominations, so I would say there's probably gonna be some value in this video. Here's the thing, so many home studio producers think that in order to get amazing productions, it has to all come down to getting amazing mixes. And spoiler, the main thing that's gonna make your production sound awesome is not the mixing. Yes, mixing is a very crucial component, it's a very important component, but it's not the one thing. The problem is that so many home studio producers produce in such a way that it actually makes it harder for them to create great mixes because they are making bad choices on the production front during the producing part. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So Nathan, what is this magical tip or trick that you have for me in today's video? And it's not actually a tip or trick, it's a process. It's the process of arranging with the mix in mind. So let's just jump on the whiteboard and talk about it. So arranging with the mix in mind. What exactly is arranging with the mix in mind? It's actually really simple. It has everything to do with frequencies. Okay, now when you're thinking about arrangement is essentially the process of what is happening, when it is happening, and then what it is doing. So for example, arrangement would be what? It's guitar, right? When? Verse 1. And then what is it doing? It's just doing a strumming pattern. So that's ultimately going to be kind of the process of arrangement. That's about as simple as it gets. Now the problem is that so many home studio producers, they take this, which is frequency, and they make mistakes by arranging in such a way where their frequencies are not working together in the arrangement. Now here's the problem. If you arrange a production, okay, so if you have a whole track, a whole production, and the arrangement has problems fundamentally with this frequency, your mixing job is going to be so difficult. Even a professional mixing engineer is going to take a look at that and be like, dude, this is not going to work. This is going to be very difficult. So what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is the idea of overload, okay? Overload. When you're thinking about arrangement, you need to be thinking about the frequency spectrum, right? You have this whole spectrum of frequencies from basically, let's say 20 hertz, okay, all the way up to about 20K, which 20K is going to be super sibilant. But the problem is that so many home studio producers will arrange in such a way that all of this stuff in here, okay, which is the mid-range, is like completely overloaded. They're going to have guitars, they're going to have keys, right? They're gonna have vocals, right? They're gonna have more guitars, right? And then you've got to have drums in there too, and there's drums in there as well. And there's all of this stuff happening, all of these rhythm guitars happening. There might even be like an arpeggiated keyboard part in there and all this stuff. And all of this is going to get extremely overloaded. And then they do the same thing on the low frequencies, okay? Where you're gonna have your kick drum, you're gonna have your bass, all this stuff happening here. But then you've got more bass, and then maybe you've got all this other junk that's filling up all of this low mid-range stuff. And guess what the problem is? The problem is that while you think, I'm making it sound fat, I'm making it sound super big. The problem is when you got all of this, what does this look like? This looks like a hot mess, right? And it's gonna sound like a hot mess too. We're not even talking about mix. We're talking about the sound of instrument, the instrument choice, the sound selections, the sound design, and how all of this interacts with each other. And then the same thing can happen on this, in the high frequencies, where you're gonna have all sorts of harshness, right? I suppose I should probably use red since we're using black. Harsh, that's all gonna be really harsh. And the problem is if everything's really harsh and you've got all of these things, you've got, high guitars, you've got synth, you've got your cymbals, all of this stuff existing up in here, guess what? It's gonna sound really harsh. And so a lot of times when people say things like, my track sounds super woofy and bassy and I just can't figure out, but it doesn't sound like it has clarity. And the crazy thing is that in many cases, if you want your track to sound bigger, it actually means that you should take some stuff out. It actually might have to do with you already have too much stuff that they're all trying to work together and you're trying to find a way to piece this together. And the problem is that kills clarity. It kills clarity. Now, this is actually a very simple concept. The concept of this, and this is why I want to show you, because you can visually see how messy this is. You can visually see that, holy smokes, if we are actually doing this and if we're arranging in such a way where we're throwing all of these instruments in all over the place and there's just, whatever, I think you can get the idea that we can visually look at this and realize, wow, there is way too much happening. Instead, what would a good example look like? Since this is super messy and super muddy, what would a good example look like? Let's clear the board and talk about it. All right, so we talked about what not to do. Let's talk about what to do. And after we do this, we're gonna look at my DAW and I'm gonna actually show you some real world examples. What we're gonna have in a solid production that is arranged properly with the mix in mind is two things in the low end, okay? So pretty much at about this range here, which we're gonna say is maybe about 100, 80 to 100 is kind of where we're gonna be going. This is the low end, okay? 80 to 100. What do we want to exist in this area? Well, what we want in this area is really two things primarily, kick and bass. Kick and bass. Now, kick and bass are also going to exist in some of the higher frequencies, but the core element, the core essence of what is going to be existing in the bottom end is going to be kick and bass. That's it. Let's kind of talk about this because this is something I think is really important to talk about. Bass, it could be more than one. But when we're thinking about using more than one, so for example, in some of the productions that I'm working on right now, I'm working on a track right now where I double track bass, pan them super hard right, hard left, and then I also have synth bass, but they are working together. It could be more than one bass, but, big but, in order for this to work, they must do what? Complement. They must complement each other. In other words, they cannot be existing in such a way where it's adding a lack of clarity. We actually are going to want to make sure that the sounds that we choose, the very essence of sound that we are using, we're talking about sound design and sound selection, they have to work together. That is a topic for another conversation. And then you've got your kick, which again, you might have more than one kick, but again, they have to complement each other. Now, what's gonna happen in the mid-range, okay? What's gonna happen in this 200 hertz to kind of up in here, in this area here, in the 2000 range and above, okay? Well, one of the biggest things, and we're gonna kind of do it like this, vocals up here, assuming that we have vocals in the production. Vocals needs to stand and have the most room, okay? Vocals need to kind of be doing this, okay? Vocals. And then what we're gonna do next, we'll say keys and guitars, okay? And then that is going to do something like this. Now, I'm not making this line to demonstrate the frequencies that they exist in, because it's going to be in this range, okay? There's not like a cutoff and a start or whatever. It's a ballpark of range. But the main reason I'm making this smaller is that in the grand scheme of things, in the arrangement, the keyboards and the guitars and things like that are going to be lower in the mix overall, so we have to bear that in mind, and this is what I'm talking about. We're thinking about, how do I actually want to mix this in the end? You want to be arranging with that in mind. So keys and guitars. Okay, now what's going to exist up in this stuff? This could also be guitars and keys. But this is going to be more the stuff that's in the higher register. So this is what we're talking about when the guitars are actually playing higher up on the neck, doing some lead stuff, for example, or keys or synth. You know, if you have a higher pad synth or a stabby synth lead part, it's going to exist higher up. This is also where your cymbals are going to exist. And this is also going to be where sibilance exists, and that's going to be on words, S's and T's and things like that, and actually that's going to be a lot more like in this kind of a range, a lot higher, 5K, not so much. Okay, so now look at this. All of a sudden, we now have a much cleaner looking example of what an arrangement might be. Now, when we're thinking about arranging, we might have lots of layers of things, but you need to be thinking in terms of the broad chunk. So what are my guitars doing? Let's make sure I'm producing guitars. You might have 5, 6, 7 different layers of guitars, but they have to be complementing each other so that they are existing in such a way where when you are arranging, you are thinking about, is this going to be a nightmare to mix? Frequency-wise. And if that is a yes, and you are putting too much stuff, you need to dial it back and really come back to this concept. So let's actually take a look at the DAW and see some real-world examples. What I'm showing you right now is not the mixed version. I'm showing you the produced version before mix. But what I really want to do is kind of break down what we've already talked about so far. Now, the very first thing is that we talked about bass, the bass elements. I want to talk about this because we look at this. These are 3 different bass elements that we have in this track in total. But what you can notice is that these 3 are not all happening at the same time. These 2 are happening at the same time quite a lot, but there are even times where we take out this Super 8 bass, okay? You can see examples here where we had all 3 and then we took it out, and then we took it out because it was just too much, okay? Now, let's go ahead and show you this, this drop right here. Okay, so that's the example of this kind of drop moment. So just looking at the bass here, okay, that's what we have. But when I play that, if I didn't show you the fact that this had 2 separate tracks, we would probably be hearing this as a single sound. And this is the problem, is that a lot of times producers will layer their basses, but the problem is they're not finding sounds that actually complement each other. They're basically just throwing in a bunch of basses because they think, I need more low end. That's not how you get more low end. The way you get more low end is by having clarity of low end, okay? They complement each other very, very well. That's the only thing happening in the bass as far as like a guitar, synthy bass kind of element. And then what do we have in the drums? Well, let's take a listen. We've got a single kick. Okay, and so we put this in context with all the percussion and all of the bass elements. Here's what we wind up with. That sounds really great. There's a lot of nice low end there, and there's a lot of clarity happening. So then we move up a little bit. Okay, what happens in the mid-range? Well, we've got these strings happening. But that's actually a lot of stuff that's happening higher up as well. We have this brass. There's a little bit more of a higher shimmer on that as well. And then we've got these things in here kind of do the same thing. But all 3 of these sounds are doing the exact same thing. So again, the whole goal here is to complement these sounds. And if we listen to them individually, here's 1. Okay, here's 2. Here's 3. So they don't even all sound that great soloed out, but you put them together. That sounds awesome. Okay, what else do we have going on here? Well, we have this piano part going on here, and this is going to be in some of the mid-range. So if you think about what's actually happening in the mid-range, it's really the piano and strings, pretty much. And what are they doing? They're doing the same thing. It's not like we have 15 different things happening all at the same time. It's two things, okay, doing the exact same thing, but they're texturally filling up a little bit of a different kind of a space. And then we have this little brass hit thing going on. And that's just accenting those hits. It's a little brighter. It's got some space up top. And then we add these melodic elements. Boom. And we'd be using panning to accomplish a wider sound. I don't think there's any panning on this right now. And then we have the vocal kind of doing its little ad-lib moment. And guess what? That's literally it. It sounds like there's so much more happening in here than there actually is. And guess what? A part of arranging with a mix in mind is having push and pull, tension and release, where there's the big moment, the small moment, the dynamic moment. We start this whole song. It's 2:45 in the morning. It's just piano and vocals. We don't even add anything until quite a bit later where this drop happens. We have this little interlude. We don't need to throw the whole kitchen sink all at once. And then with verse 2. So what am I supposed to say when it won't mean much? If you have the most pristine sounding production in the world, but it's less interesting than watching paint dry, I would argue that's not a very good production. But on the other hand, if you have a production that maybe sounds a bit scruffy, we'll say, but the way it's done is wildly interesting, I would argue that's overall a good production. See, a lot of home studio producers get in their heads that if it sounds pristine, then that's the goal. But really, the goal should actually be creating something that is interesting to listen to and then executed well. Of course, we want our music to sound great in terms of, sonics and the technical aspects, but there are so many examples of music that really does not sound like it was produced the best, but yet is loved by the masses because the song is so interesting. And this is the big mistake I see producers making. You're producing music without differentiating moment to moment. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that so many producers wind up essentially copying verse 1 and then just kind of like plugging it into verse 2, or copying the chorus and then saying, well, we got the chorus done, we'll just kind of copy that over here and that's now our chorus too. And then they make that every chorus and nothing really changes. Now, obviously that's kind of extreme. Maybe you're not doing that. Maybe you're not copy pasting exactly. But here's another way that this actually happens. You have your verse 1 and then maybe you don't copy over those exact parts, but you essentially do the same thing in the next verse. So even though you didn't copy it, it's still basically the same. The way that I want to produce music is so that there is always something new coming up for the listener to experience. There's always some unique way that I want to do something so that when a new moment comes up, the listener is surprised. And maybe it's not even like a whoa surprise, but it's almost like having these small nuggets of musical goodness sprinkled throughout the song. I always want to save something for later so that as someone listens, there's always something to tickle their ear, so to speak. And this is how we make music that is differentiated. If you want to make music that people feel hooked to listen to, then repeating ideas over and over is a fantastic way of doing the opposite. Now, when I say repetition, that goes beyond just repeating an exact melody or exact chord progression. That could also mean repeating something sonically. So what I mean by that is you can have a unique verse, but everything about the production or the arrangement sounds too similar to everything else that has been heard. Sure, you're using different chords, it's a different melody, but every other part of it is the same. In other words, it might be different, but if you're using the exact same sounds, the same patterns, the same articulations with your instruments and such, then if it's not a direct repetition exactly, the result is kind of the same effect. It feels like a repetition. Something I do with my students is I will scrub through their song and then show them how every 15 to 20 seconds just sounds the same if this is a problem they're dealing with. So, I would go in my session here, I would start it up here, and then I would skip ahead to different parts in the actual song. And then I'm gonna see, does this sound pretty much the same as every other moment before it? And if so, that ain't good, right? So if you're listening to one part of the song and then skip ahead to another, and it sounds just virtually identical, that's a really big problem in my mind. And by the way, of course you're gonna find lots of examples where there is a lot of repetition. I'm not saying this is a black and white thing, so I don't want you to misunderstand me. There are times where maybe that is what you're going for. But just from a personal perspective and from what I see in the music that I think is the best personally, because we're all gonna have our own biases, I think this is how you should do it. You should be striving to have something unique for every moment. And I'm not talking about throwing a million things and overloading your arrangements so that it's actually confusing. That's not what I'm saying. There is a level of moderation, and the beautiful thing is that you can go extreme and make things wildly different, which can work. And that actually tends to be kind of my personal preference. But you can also be really subtle about it as well. So maybe verse 1 has a simple piano part. Maybe it's just simple block chords. But then verse 2 is the same progression, same melody, but instead of you approaching that piano part by just doing block chords, maybe now you're adding a rhythmic pattern. You're doing broken chords, you're arpeggiating things, you're changing up the pattern. Now that can be a relatively subtle difference. It's just pushing the arrangement forward a little bit. It's the same chords, it's the same instrument. It doesn't really come across as over the top, but nonetheless, it's different. Maybe it even just has to do with how you are voicing those chords. You're not just directly doing the same thing like, oh, all right guys, just put a repeat sign here. And that is a way of differentiating verse 1 from verse 2 with an instrument like the piano. Now you can do this by simply changing the pattern. You can also do this by changing the actual articulation. Maybe you have a guitar strumming pattern or a finger picking pattern, right? But what we can do is in verse 2, to make that sound more unique and differentiated from verse 1, well, we could simply change the articulation. Perhaps we're now gonna go to a palm muted articulation. You know what, let me show you. A little out of tune here. So we're gonna have a strumming pattern. Okay, that's cool, that's verse 1. But what about verse 2? Right? Now that's different. It's the same instrument, it's just a different articulation. I'm gonna put this away now. So let's actually take a look at a full production. Here's one of my songs. This is just gonna be the instrumental. We actually haven't tracked vocals yet, but it's a really good example, I think. So if we listen to verse 1, where everything starts, it sounds like this. All right, so we're setting the pace here. This has no drums. It's aggressive, but it's not like huge yet. And we're carving out some room for the vocal, right? So sound-wise, we've got this subby kind of dirty bass. We've got these muted pianos kind of doubling that, right? Just to kind of add some attack, some aggression. And then we've got this filtered out and pulsating sound. And then we've got this synth ostinato pattern here. It sounds nice, it's interesting to listen to, it kind of leaves you wondering where are we gonna go. But what about verse 2? Let's go ahead and actually do this practice that I suggested, which is skipping ahead to different parts of the song. So again, here's verse 1, and I'm gonna skip ahead to verse 2. Verse 1. All right, let's go to verse 2. This is leading up to it. Heyo. Right? Now there's still gonna be vocals in this, right? The melody's different, it's different, but this is a pretty extreme example, right? Like we've got this same ostinato pattern that kind of ties and glues this whole thing together. But then we go to a completely different articulation with the keyboard instrument, this plucked keyboard. Really attacky. It's kind of carrying over and gluing that whole aggressive thing from verse 1. So this is not like, hey, just completely change it up so it's like not even the same song. Of course we want to glue things together. We're going to have certain components that we want to kind of bring in, but it's recontextualizing it. But one of the biggest aspects of this that is completely unique are the drums and the 808. We've got all of this stuff going on in here, right here. Now, honestly, this is pretty extreme. This is super cool though. I wanted this verse 2 to be a huge moment. And I really want listeners to experience this like, whoa, what just happened, right? I want this moment to kind of turn some heads. That's really more my personal style. That's how I like things, okay? But then even if we skip ahead, this is still verse 2, but this is kind of like verse 2, but the B section of verse 2, it changes again. I'll kind of lead us into this a little bit. So this is a couple bars before. Here we go. Nice textural thing that changes the entire thing. We've got strings all of a sudden, listen to this. Tying and gluing that whole synth thing together, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening that are different, but I'm still gluing everything together. So there are some similarities, but it comes across as very different on purpose. And maybe you don't like this, right? You don't have to like this. This is a creative choice. But nonetheless, I don't think that anyone's gonna argue that this is highly differentiated from that first verse. The problem is that so many, now I know this might offend some people, but the problem is that so many people are either lazy and they just don't want to put in the work to actually do this by making it interesting moment by moment, or the more likely alternative is you just might not even know what you even can do in the first place to make these things different. So if you know how, but you're just being lazy, then stop being lazy. But I think really most of you are in the boat of really just not knowing how to make it different. So here are some simple things to try. First, instead of trying to make things wildly different, like in this example, focus on using the same instruments, but finding new patterns or new articulations to make each moment unique from section to section, like I did with the guitar. If you have like a sustained part, right, on verse 1, like just piano chords, then go for a more rhythmic part for verse 2. Try thinking in opposites. What is the opposite of sustained? Well, it's rhythmic. What's the opposite of soft? Well, it's loud. What is the opposite of whatever it is that you started with? And try coming up with unique ways to make those different. So in other words, don't try to reinvent the wheel here. Second is to try utilizing different sounds in different sections. This doesn't need to be like a full 180 where you all of a sudden go into a totally different, direction or a different style. It could be as simple as just changing one or two instruments for something different. If you have a piano, then maybe switch to another keyboard instrument or guitar or a synth instead, or strings, right? So you have lots of options that you can jump into. The core idea is that you are trying to deepen the experience by introducing new sounds, right? New sounds are a great way of keeping a production interesting throughout. If we look at this example, we have this muted piano that's plucked, right? That sounds like one way, but then I'm still using a plucked piano, which is a similar kind of sound, but the actual sound itself is completely different. Listen. There's distortion on it, it's super attacky, it's really compressed, all those things, so it sounds very different, but it's still kind of in the same category of instrument. So that's what I'm talking about. Use similar categories, but different sounds. And third is try zooming out and thinking about the whole song from start to finish, and really ask, like, where is the biggest part gonna go? And where is the softest part gonna go? And aim to make each section dynamically different. Now, this means that you're gonna be making each section unique in terms of perceived volume or intensity, which is something I did in this example too. Verse 1 has a lower perceived intensity, and then verse 2 has a really high intensity, right? And if we actually skip ahead to the bridge, check out the bridge. Completely different level of intensity. I use the bridge to really bring down the intensity and to add more of a swelling effect. So if you think about that bridge, right, the strings and it's more ethereal, it's softer, it's really kind of more emotive. And you compare that to verse 2, again, very, very different intensity level. The main thing here is just thinking about how you want to differentiate your sections in terms of overall intensity and overall dynamic. If your song is the same dynamically from start to finish, I'm gonna be honest, it's really hard to keep things interesting without finding other ways to do that. Arrangement is one of those things that is so key and so fundamental in producing amazing music. And if you don't understand how to build compelling arrangements, then it really doesn't matter how much of a technical wizard you are as a producer, your productions will still sound meh. So there is an arrangement technique I'm going to show you in this video that will almost certainly change how you go about making music if you apply it. One of the biggest ways that you can make better music is by having arrangements that have contrast. Now, contrast is a bit of a loaded word because in this case that I'm using it, it's actually related to several things. But if you can create arrangements that have contrast, you will make arrangements that sound more interesting to your listener. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see in productions is arrangements that are simply boring. They don't go anywhere interesting. Same sounds, same dynamics. No contrast. I mean, if there's no contrast, then why keep listening? If a song is simply repeating the same thing over and over, most listeners will skip and listen to something different, unless we are talking about genres that repetition is the goal, like ambient music. So let's actually define what I mean when I say contrast. Contrast is really all about something being different, right? So if verse 1 of a song is soft, then a very simple method of adding contrast would to make verse 2 loud. That would be dynamically adding contrast because we are simply using dynamics or volume to make something different. There is contrast because of volume, soft versus loud. And this is a theme. Versus. In most cases, you can identify if there is contrast by pitting one concept versus another, soft versus loud, long versus short, percussive versus non-percussive, etc., etc. And we're going to dig into examples here. So another way is that verse 1 could be utilizing sustained and elongated rhythms where the chords are sustained like this. So verse 1 has now set the tone that it is elongated and sustained. So verse 2 would be a great place to add contrast by instead using the opposite of sustained, which is added rhythm. And we can actually do this by changing nothing but the articulation that the instrument is being played, like this. It's the exact same chords, but it sounds completely different because there is contrast. So if we put these side by side within the context of a song where verse 1 is sustained and then verse 2 is not sustained, it could sound like this. Let's assume this is verse 2 now. And that, my friends, is what we call contrast by articulation or rhythmic variation. Non-rhythmic versus rhythmic. And we can do this 100 different ways with different articulations. I could also use more of these arps instead of staccato. So instead of this, we could do... right? Or we could change the rhythmic pulse to be less staccato and more of an in-between sustained and in-between staccato. So there are all of these varying degrees, right? So my whole point is that by simply changing the articulation and the rhythmic pulse, we have immediately introduced musical contrast. Now there are obviously varying degrees of this, right? So we can add contrast within the same verse by starting sustained and then building into more contrast by adding volume or dynamic. So this isn't necessarily just verse 1 and verse 2, but it could also be within the same verse, right? We could change the rhythmic foundation or articulation and that would sound different. So let me actually show you within an actual production. This is one of my own productions. Without vocals, this is verse 1. And what you're gonna see here is in these first 4 bars right in here, we're gonna have sustain. And in these second 4 bars, we're gonna all of a sudden have percussion. So here how the contrast happens inside of the same verse. Pluck, rhythm. This is all within the exact same verse. We now have contrast from the first 4 bars to the second 4 bars. So now instead of zooming out and thinking verse 1 and verse 2 having contrast, we now have contrast within the context of a single verse, and this makes it more interesting to listen to. Like, what would you rather hear? Would you rather hear 8 bars of just that sustained stuff, or actually having the 4 bars sustained and then all of a sudden the 4 bars of that rhythmic contrast with the drums coming in, these plucked elements, the rhythmic contrast? And I think I know the answer to that, because in most cases, we're gonna wanna listen to the one with contrast. And again, all this is obviously dependent on the context. This is not a black and white point, right? This is a concept that you need to decide how to use within your own music. So think of your arrangement as a painter thinks of colors. Colors are used to introduce contrast. Black versus white, light versus dark, blue versus red. You get the idea. And we have all of these varying shades that are in between. So this isn't me saying do X, Y, Z and copy me. I'm instead trying to give you a conceptual idea of what you can do. The core of it is use contrast. If you have no contrast, then it makes it very difficult to really want to listen to more, right? I mean, do you want to listen to music that goes nowhere unique? It just sounds the same volume, articulation, same everything? And again, obviously, I think some of you may say this is genre dependent. I don't disagree, but even if you listen to like taiko or other somewhat more ambient styles of music, there's usually still contrast happening. It's just over a slower period of time. So think of it like this. We can modify this concept based on the genre, but nonetheless, whether you make pop, hip hop, or cinematic or rock music, this concept can fit within any style of music. It's just how you go about applying it that may be different. Again, not black and white, a concept. So in a rock track, for example, the contrast might be that you start with a boom, 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 palm muted guitar, right? And you might start that way in the verse. And you might open up to power chords in the chorus. Right? Don't mind me, doing this with my mouth, right? So this is rhythmic and articulation contrast. One is more held back and rhythmic, right? That verse, and the chorus would be wide open and sustained with power. Either way, that is actual contrast. You can utilize drums for contrast. In the example I just showed here, we have that verse 1 starts no drums, and then verse 1, kind of the second part of it, it does use drums, and that adds contrast. So for me personally, I like using stark contrast in my music. So let me show you what I mean in this same example. So if we start in verse 1, and then I skip ahead to the chorus. So verse 1, again, starts with this kind of, it's ethereal. But if we were to go to the chorus, here's the bar leading up to the chorus. Here's the contrast. contrast, right? So one is more ethereal, and then we kind of get the plucky stuff, but then it opens wide up, right? It's a little bit of a different kind of rhythm. We're on a ride cymbal instead of a hi-hat cymbal. We have open articulations. The gang vocals add this contrast because you got these falsetto-y kind of airy vocal layers. The reverb, all of this is heavily contrasted from the verse. But then if we get into verse 2, we can skip ahead a little bit. We're gonna have that same feeling of verse 1, but this time we're gonna have drums, staccato pattern, more plucked elements, and it contrasts verse 1. Here we go. No bass, plucks, drums. Now we add the bass. This is all about adding contrast. Like, that is everything I'm thinking about whenever I'm producing music and making music. I'm thinking, how can I add more contrast into my music? So I personally like music that is heavily differentiated from moment to moment. Now, this might be more than you prefer, because ultimately this does come down to creative decisions. How far do you want to go with this, right? The beauty of musical concepts like this is that you can take it where you want to take it. Maybe you slowly modify, slowly differentiate. Maybe you go all in on it and go hard, or maybe you find some balance. You have contrast, but it's not too crazy. It's up to you, and that is the beauty. But if you're using the same sounds all the way through without changing articulation, and you're not changing anything, you're not adding any contrast, it's almost always going to make for a boring arrangement.
This is a really good question here. How is your arrangement so clean? So this is a really good question. So one of the biggest ways you can know if your arrangement is feeling good is you have to be thinking about things in terms of sonic spectrum, or not sonic spectrum, but in terms of like the frequency range. So for example, if we were to go to like the chorus here, we've got piano, which is covering a higher spectrum of frequency, right? So if we've got this, right, so that's higher. Then we've got another thing that's higher as well. This is also more textural, so this is covering something that is different than what the piano is covering. Then we've got the low end here, which is a whole different frequency spectrum. You need to keep in mind that that bass also has a lot of bite to it, so that's also taking up some space up higher. The strings are also covering a lot more of the mid-range, but also some of the upper spectrum. But there's also something happening different from an articulation standpoint. So when you're thinking about arrangement, there are actually several things that you're thinking about when it comes to arrangement. The very first is the actual frequency, which is nothing more than pitch. Like when we think of frequency, it's really easy to be thinking about frequency like this, like looking at like an EQ. When I'm talking about frequency in terms of the arrangement, I'm talking about frequency specifically as it relates to pitch. How high or how low is it? And a good arrangement is going to have a healthy blend of lows, mids, and highs. And so when you're thinking about this from the perspective of arrangement, that's one component of arrangement. The second component of arrangement is texture, which would be the articulation. What is actually happening with XYZ instruments? So if we're thinking about a piano can articulate a handful of different ways. A piano can play things that are going to function a little bit more like a pad, which would be just whole note chords, right? They can also arpeggiate, they can pluck, they can do all of these different types of articulations. So when we're thinking about arrangement and having a clean arrangement, a big part of it is having a healthy blend of sustain, pluck, and other articulations that are going to fit together to do whatever it is that you want to do in that particular arrangement. So in this case, I'm starting out with a little bit more of a sustained arrangement at the very beginning, right? So if we think about the start here, this is where the vocals would come in. The piano is doing something somewhat melodic, right? This would be kind of like a counter melody. It's going to be pushing against the vocal a little bit, which can be a really useful and powerful thing. It's also a highly repeatable melody, which means this is something that we can continuously come back to throughout the composition. Now, this is composition that we're talking about, which is tied into arrangement, but that piano is playing a counter melodic aspect, right? Everything else is playing a more sustained element. We don't have bass, which means I'm saving the bass for once we get into it a little bit more, right? So then we get to this first chorus, listen what happens, and really pay attention to the actual pitch spectrum. We have more pitch represented in this chorus from the low end all the way to the high end, and the vocals are also going to be in here, which it's a female singer, so she's going to have a higher frequency, right? Higher pitch. And we're also going to be processing it to have more breath and more air. So that's also going to be adding some of that shimmer on the top. But on the bottom, we have this nice filtered bass. And then in the middle, we have the staccato strings, which are changing the entire articulation. So if we kind of get into this, I'll start just a couple bars back and then push into the chorus. Really think and pay attention to what are the actual textures that are happening beyond pitch. It's more than just pitch. It's more than just frequency, but it's what are the actual instruments doing that is unique and textural. And here. So all of a sudden now we have something sounding quite a bit more textural here, right? The strings dun 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 dun. But notice here the other powerful thing that we can do with arrangement is actually utilizing duplication, but with just different articulations. Like the piano is doing the same thing the strings are doing. Right, but the piano's not doing dun 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 dun. I'm letting the strings do that. The piano is functioning differently, even though it's doing the exact same melodic content. It's got the same melodic content, but it is doing something different functionally in terms of articulation. The strings then take that, we add some rhythm to it, we add that staccato vibe to it, so it's gonna have a little bit more cut, a little bit more of that push, right? And then the only other things we have are these two elements in here, which are a little bit more textural. Right? We got the bass in there. Obviously, that's not textural. That's the bass. I was kind of meaning to show you the other two things. But those things are more textural. Those are kind of like the ear candy, if you will. Much less important. Like if those weren't there, it's not the end of the world if it's not there. But those are just kind of adding some of that nuance and intrigue through it. And then I'm applying that same kind of principle, that same kind of concept of arrangement throughout the entirety of the song and trying to do things in a way where every part of the song has its own unique piece of that arrangement puzzle, right? So I'm not going to be overly repeating something because that gets boring. And instead, I want to be pushing and pulling. I want to be utilizing dynamics. I want to be utilizing all these different aspects of arrangement that are going to help make it so that as someone listens to this song, they're not bored out of their mind. They're not thinking, oh yeah, I've heard this already. Oh yeah, I've heard this already. Let's do something different, right? Instead, it needs to be always like, oh, we're going somewhere. Oh, we're going somewhere. Oh, we're going somewhere, which keeps someone really interested in what they're listening to. So we go from this chorus into this instrumental, and notice what happens once we get out of this instrumental right in here into the verse. Everything sparses down. Why? Well, because that's super dynamic. It's going to help make it so that the vocal is going to cut through a lot more, saving room for that. We're also removing the low end, which is making it so that when the low end comes back in, it's very interesting. It's very unique. And so arrangement is a lot more than just like throw stuff in and hopefully it sounds good. It's not a guessing game. It should be strategic. And the better I am at, like the more time I spend doing it, the more I can just make these decisions very quickly, right? Like I don't have to think about this stuff as much as I maybe used to. But when you're doing this, you need to be thinking about, okay, like how am I adding push and pull? How am I making it so my arrangement is actually truly going somewhere? So let's listen to this instrumental here, going into the verse, and really pay attention to how there are always these little new things happening every 4 bars to just push the whole thing forward. Something different. No bass. Very simple. It's stripped down here. And then here we go. The low end is here now. But I'm not adding strings here. Like I could have added strings. Dun 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 dun. But that'd be too much too soon. I want to hold off on that. No. You got to wait till we get to the chorus for you to get to those strings. I want to wait. I don't want to give you too much stuff too soon. If you give too much too soon, it's like showing your hand too early. Like I want to make it so that it's like no. You got to wait till later on in the song to hear the best part. And that is how you keep a listener engaged. That's how you make it so that that last chorus, or as you're getting closer to that last chorus, that's when you get people who are saying, holy crap, that's sick. Don't give it away too soon. If you give it away too soon, You're missing out on a lot of opportunities just purely from an arrangement standpoint. Obviously, how you would mix this is a completely different conversation. But when you're thinking about arrangement and how do you have a clean arrangement, it's not about having a ton of different things going on. It's actually about utilizing smart layering, making sure that you have elements that are covering what the other element does, but doing it in a different type of timbre, a different type of texture, a different articulation. So if we look at this big chorus now, the main thing is that dun 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 dun, right? And the strings, which is doing the exact same thing, is happening in the piano, right? So the exact same thing is happening in the piano. It's just a different articulation. And then we have bigger bass, right? Because I want to amp it up in this chorus. It needs to be amped up. I want it to be brighter, right? And then we've just got bigger drums, bigger drum production. We have a little bit of a rise in there, nice hit. The cymbals get changed. I have now a hi-hat going on, grooving, a little bit more distortion on that. But other than that, like this sounds huge, but if you think about it, the piano and all the strings are doing basically the same thing, just different timbre, different articulation, different instruments. We've got two bass elements doing the same thing, but they're just big. We've got this pulsating element here, which is just textural. That's just textural. And then we've got the drums, and drums are kind of its own unique category. But even look at the drums. We have a metal hit, a snare, kick, hi-hat, and that's it. That's all there is. And so when you're thinking about this, you don't need to be thinking about, oh my gosh, I got to throw a bajillion things in here. Like I've got 58 tracks in here right now. But in this big chorus, I don't have 58 instruments happening. Your arrangements do not need to be so big and so dense that you're utilizing all these tracks. It's all about smart layering. And yeah, I can repeat this all day long until I'm blue in the face, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. When you are arranging, it's about 1, 2, maybe 3 things that you're really trying to get across to your audience, and utilize smart layering, smart articulations, and smart textures, and you will have much cleaner arrangements.
There is an insanely powerful tool in composition that if you use, it'll change how you make music, probably forever. Many of you are using it unknowingly, and many of you don't know it, don't use it, and as a result, your music is generally speaking not where it could be. It's called the rule of 3, and this is not something I made up. It's something you can analyze in music across not just the past decade, 2 decades, or even several decades. This is something that you can analyze in music over the course of literally hundreds of years. And as producers, songwriters, and composers, you need to know this because it's proven to work over and over again. Now, before I share this with you, inevitably many of you will find plenty of popular examples of music that breaks this rule. Heck, Nine Inch Nails didn't exactly follow traditional musical convention, nor did Dream Theater, nor did Philip Glass, or many other composers, artists, and producers who intentionally break convention. So this rule is a guideline, one that you can break, but if you don't know it, then you may be breaking it unintentionally or in a way that is not truly on purpose. So here it is. The rule of 3 is all about how many times you should repeat musical ideas and what to do to prevent over-repetition. And it actually has a lot to do with our brains and how our brains process information. If I say something to you once, then it's an idea that you've heard one time. If I say it a second time, it's reinforcing that idea. But if I say it a third time, this is where things get a little bit weird, because in some cases, it further reinforces a concept, but in most cases, this is where our brain will actually begin to tune it out. So how does this correlate to music? I'm going to demonstrate what I mean. So if I play a musical idea, a 4-bar progression with a melody, something like this, now, if I play that just one time, like I just did, you're listening to that as a first-time listener. You've never heard it before, so it's intriguing, and you're interested. It piques the interest of your brain, which makes it easy to listen to start to finish. If I repeat this idea again, and instead play it twice, back to back, like this, now your brain has reinforced this musical idea internally. In other words, at this point, you could probably sing it back to me. Dun, 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 right? Pretty simple. Your mind has remembered how it sounds, has caught onto the cue that it's a repetition. But if I play it 3 times in a row, like this, 1, 2, by the 3rd time, your brain is actually automatically making decisions, potentially without you even knowing about it. Primarily, that you are now losing interest. This is why the rule of 3 is so important. When you write or produce a musical concept like a 4-bar phrase, like what I just played, many amateurs are going to continue looping this idea, repeating it way too much. Repeating something beyond 3 times is, generally speaking, overusing that idea, and actually using it more than 2 times is overusing it. Now, you may be tempted to click off this video and think you get it, but hang with me because there's more. A line I say very often inside of my program Producer Accelerator and to my students when I give feedback, and specifically when it comes to these types of situations when there is excessive repetition, it's this: too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. Really think about that. Too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. Now I want you to notice something. Did you notice how I just repeated that a second time, that phrase? That actually reinforced the idea that I'm trying to get across to you. Too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. See what happened again? Upon me saying that a third time, it's pretty likely that you've already internally started to feel like, yeah, you said that already. I get it. Do you follow? But the saying is true. If I were to say that line, that saying 3 times, by that third time, you get it. You understand the point. Okay, let's move on to something different, right? This is also why if I show my wife a new song and I continue showing it to her over and over and over and over again because I'm excited, guess what? After a handful of times listening, my wife will essentially no longer like that song. It gets old, it's overused, overdone. The rule of 3 is all about how to capture attention and then hold it without abusing it. This is the name of the game when it comes to creating music that is compelling. And I do have to note that if you don't care about holding someone's attention, do what you want. But I think most of us want to create music that others will genuinely enjoy and listen to and want to re-listen to. But if you are over-repeating ideas and breaking this convention, the rule of 3, you are inevitably losing attention and losing interest. So you're probably thinking, what should I do then? It's simple. There are really 2 options that I typically am aiming for. The first is that you play an idea, like the one that we did, repeat it 1 time, so you're playing it 2 times in total. This is reinforcing the concept because obviously if you only play it once, then it's not enough time for the brain to truly remember. If I were to play that melody for you, you've never heard it before, and I only play it 1 time, it's more likely that you'll actually not remember it. You probably won't be able to sing it back to me, but if I play it twice, you're more likely to remember it. And the third time, you have the first option, which is to simply go somewhere different musically. It could be a new melody with the same chords, or it could be a new progression along with a new melody. The second option is to start the concept the same the third time, but instead go somewhere different with it, maybe halfway through that idea or the progression. So you're starting the same, but going somewhere different. So let me actually demonstrate each. So here's the first option where I'm gonna play this through and I'm gonna go somewhere completely different. So I'm gonna play it as if this is the second time I'm playing it. Da, 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 da. It sounds related. I'm using the same chord progression, but musically we've gone somewhere completely different. And again, this piques interest because all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is something different. This is something new. I don't know where we're going. And these are the types of things that tell our brains you should keep listening because you don't know where it's going to go. If your brain is always knowing where it's going to go, then why listen? Here's the second option where I'm going to start at the same, but then I'm going to go somewhere different. Start the same. So we started the same, right? The same. So you're thinking, oh, okay, we're just gonna repeat this again, right? And then it goes somewhere different. So it's starting in such a way where it's like, oh yeah, I've heard this before. But you haven't because we're gonna go somewhere different. So these are 2 really great options, and each of these options has a good place in music, and it's gonna depend on the context and what you really want to accomplish. And this is where we can get really creative. Something I believe wholeheartedly in is making intentional musical decisions. If you wanna make better music, then stop guessing and instead truly think about what you wanna do with your music. What are your goals with the song? What response do you want the audience to have by listening to it? And use these choices to guide your musical decisions. It's all about being intentional. When you are intentional, it means you can more consistently create music that is more meaningful and less random. The rule of 3 is simple, but after teaching almost 1,000 producers in the past year and a half, this is one of the biggest mistakes I see. I run weekly feedback calls, and this is a mistake that I correct very regularly. And if you fix this mistake, it will change how you make music. If your arrangement is stale or it lacks dynamics or it feels too much the same, then the reality is that you are losing your listeners' attention. So if you don't care about keeping your audience interested in your music, then you can probably go watch a cat fail video. But if you want to keep your music interesting to your audience and you want to work hard to entertain them, then I'd probably stick around till the last tip, which is probably going to blow your mind. So I'm going to share 5 arrangement tips that will help you make your music hit harder and be more interesting. Number 1, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. I want to make sure you understand what I mean here because this is very important. What this means is that if you have something really cool that you introduce in your song, if you overuse that thing, then essentially it loses its power and impact and is no longer a cool thing because you've overused it. And this is one of those things that honestly took me so many years to understand fully, because I used to have a moment that was like really cool and I'd be like, oh dang, this is so sick, I gotta just use this a bunch. And then what ends up happening is that thing becomes boring and it's no longer a good thing. It's no longer interesting because I overdid it. So you need to think of your music a little bit like teasing your listener's ear throughout the entirety of that song. If you have an arrangement element that's really cool, this might be a melody, it could be a lick, it could be like a really cool drum part. If you continuously play this thing over and over and over again because you think it's cool, your listener is probably going to get bored. Me and my team have given feedback to my students every week in my course Producer Accelerator, and this comes up very frequently. A lot of times there's a really cool element that happens and then it just gets overused, and as a result it loses all of its power. So when you are making music, think of these really interesting moments as opportunities to tease an idea that the listener gets a taste of, but then it goes away and it goes somewhere different. And there's often going to be a little bit of this implication that that thing will come back, which hooks your listener because they want to hear it again. So in this hypothetical example, you introduce some really cool idea. Maybe it's a melody or a counter melody. Do that thing and then move somewhere different. And a lot of times what ends up happening is the listener is internally thinking, that was really cool, I hope that comes back later. And as long as you fulfill that expectation later, it can feel so much more satisfying. Just think about how often this happens in the music that you listen to, that you love. Something really cool happens, and then you know it's gonna happen later on because you've heard the song however many times. So in a way, you almost feel compelled to stay listening just to hear that thing again. That's what I mean. But if that thing was done just over and over and over again, it's way more likely to lose its impact. So be tasteful when you're thinking of how often to repeat ideas. Repetition is obviously a very powerful element that you can use in your music, but over repetition dulls the ears. Too much of a good thing ain't a good thing no more. That kind of sounding country. I don't even make country music. Number 2. Verse 2 is an opportunity. I cannot tell you how often I hear songs from students where verse 2 is literally a copy-paste from verse 1. And I gotta say, you are missing such a great opportunity when you do this. Verse 2 is just that, a great opportunity to keep your listener interested in the music. As an artist and producer myself, I want verse 2 to provide more context to my listener. And if you copy paste your arrangement into verse 2, the truth is, 1, you're being lazy, and you're also not giving your listener a new perspective on the song. I don't want you to mishear me when I say this. I'm not saying verse 2 needs to be totally different and should confuse your listener. That's obviously taking us too far. But some of the things that I do in my second verses are finding new sounds that create new textures. I'll oftentimes use different chord voicings. In other words, I'm using the same chord progression, but change how I actually stack those chords on the instruments vertically that I'm using. We're gonna be talking about that here in a little bit. So it does sound similar, but it's very clearly different. Another great way to enhance the second verse is through percussion and rhythm. I almost always utilize drums and percussion differently from verse 1 to verse 2 to keep things interesting. If you're doing the exact same drum loop, the exact same drum groove, or different percussive elements are all the same from verse 1 to verse 2, way more likely to be boring. Drums and percussion are one of the key ways that you can keep it more interesting. Rhythm is half of music, so if you want to show a different angle on something, change the rhythm elements. If verse 1 has no percussion, verse 2 can be a great place to add percussion to add interest. And rhythm goes far beyond drums. This is also a big part of your tonal instruments as well. You know, maybe verse 1 is just using plucked out chords on the piano. In verse 2, you might go to more of an arpeggio. That's also leveraging rhythm to keep things more interesting. And like I said, oftentimes I'm using different sounds from verse 1 to verse 2. So if I have a piano-driven verse 1, I'll maybe use a different instrument in verse 2. Oftentimes I'll still use piano in verse 2, but I'm going to use it differently. Like maybe I put it in a different octave, it's doing different rhythms, and I'm using some other instrument to take the lead. There are a million different ways that you can do this, but the point that I'm trying to make is to stop throwing away verse 2 and instead search for ways to make your second verses the springboard to the rest of the song. I really think verse 2 is one of my favorite aspects of a song because it's that time that I can take something that's already been heard and completely change how you hear it. Killer arrangements very frequently use verse 2 as a springboard for the back half of the song. Never miss a great opportunity in your second verse. Number 3, layering is your friend. One of the biggest differences between professional level productions and the rest comes down to how it actually sounds sonically, and it turns out that a big part of that difference is actually in the arrangement and choice of layers. I've given a lot of feedback on songs where the arrangement is sonically very boring, even though the bones and the structure is really good. Like the song is good, it's a good song melodically, it's interesting, it's dynamic, might even have really good performances. but it feels like it's missing depth. And unfortunately, a lot of producers would think something like you're not using enough compression, or maybe you need to use reverb more, or EQ, or basically it's a mixing hack, which I'm not saying is not possible. It very likely could be. But the reality is that more often than not, when I'm listening to these songs, it's the sounds themselves that are lacking depth and need more layers, and mix hacks are probably not going to help in the first place that much. This alone is a topic that could make for many videos, but when I'm talking about layering, I'm talking about using 2 or more sounds together, doing the same thing or something very similar to create sonic depth. In other words, one sound is adding to another in ways that it's lacking. And this is how you can have rough mixed productions that sound better than most producers' final mix, because the sounds themselves have more meat to them. And more often than not, I'm using multiple elements on each part to richen up the sound, because it's extremely difficult to find a single sound that accomplishes the depth required for it to sound really great. When I'm layering elements, whether it's a synth or strings or pads or bass, the key things that I'm listening for is, what is this sound missing? And then I'm gonna find another sound that has that thing to fill in the gaps. A great example I think that's very relevant is bass. You may have a bass part that's really subby, but it lacks some of the high end that cuts through. Well, a lot of people are gonna say that you should just use an EQ. That's like 90% of YouTube videos are just gonna tell you use an EQ and just crank the highs. But why not find another bass element that has that characteristic and layer it in and potentially roll off some of the lows of it so you're not getting too much of the subby stuff? You just did 2 things at once by doing that. The first thing is you solved the problem of not having a bass that cuts, which is fixed by this, but you're also simultaneously adding depth to the overall sonic characteristic of that sound. Now you have 2 bass elements that sound like one bass element that if you were to take one away, it would completely alter the entire bass sound. Your listeners are not gonna know that it's 2 bass sounds together. But if you were to just utilize EQ, then you're simply adding more volume to what was already there instead of actually adding something genuinely new that adds depth. This concept can be used on almost anything: guitar, bass, keys, strings, drums, and even vocals, by the way. If you want arrangements that sound richer in terms of the actual sound itself, then utilize layering. Also, trust your ears. If something doesn't really make a difference, just don't use it, because I think a lot of people, what they do is they hear, this idea of using layers, and then they add all these layers, and then by the end of it, if you were to like take some of those layers out, it doesn't even make a difference. So make bold decisions. This is something that I actually really think is super important for producers to know, is that when you're making decisions about sounds, or even when to use EQ to crank some of the highs, for example, you should crank it until you hear it. Make sweeping decisions. Don't be doing these little like 1 dB changes that you're not even gonna tell that it makes a difference. So if a sound isn't actually making a difference, just don't use it and find something else. But what I find here is that if I'm doing this right, if I mute one of the elements and I only have one by itself, it makes a huge difference. So layers are your friend. By the way, as a quick interjection, the end of the year is right around the corner, and we are offering my full course producer accelerator for 50% off right now until the new year. I actually just finished adding an entire module in the course on arrangement. So if you want to go way deeper than I can go in this video, I highly recommend you join. We have around 1,500 members worldwide, and we have an incredibly high review rating on Trustpilot. I have a link below. I can't wait to meet you inside the private community and hear your music. Number 4, plan the climax. Every good story has an arc, and music is no different. When you're producing your song, you should plan where the high point is before you get too far into the process. Or at minimum, if you're one of those people like me, sometimes you get in the flow of things and you want to just kind of get going here. You just need to have it tucked away in the back of your mind that you need to have a climax, and you should probably know where that is. I hear songs all the time where there is no clear climax or high point. And oftentimes this is going to be in the final chorus, but it can also be in the bridge, it can be an epic outro or whatever. Ultimately, you can choose what your song is calling for. But the point is that if you don't think about what the climax is or when that thing happens, you might end up making arrangement choices that make the entire song feel like it dynamically didn't actually live up to expectations. Now, the kind of music that I make is extremely dynamic. If you were to go and actually listen to my music on Spotify, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm a really big fan of very dynamic music, and not all genres call for exaggerated dynamics like what I do. However, dynamics themselves are proportional. This means that you choose what the high and low is dynamically in the context of the song. You may have a low point that is still going with drums. It's still grooving because maybe it's a higher energy song, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a low point. It just isn't as exaggerated. The times that this is especially difficult is when it is a song that is a higher energy song, because the dynamics are not going to be as wide. In other words, the loudest moment compared to the quietest moment, it's not going to be as spread out. It might be a little bit more narrow, but they still needs to exist. So you have to make more intentional choices around how to make something feel a bit bigger at the climax. And the beauty is that this can obviously be big changes, like really dynamic stuff. It can be bigger changes, but it can also be really subtle changes that are more almost subconscious to the listener. For example, I'm working on a record right now that's a very cinematic album, and at the climax of the songs, I'm using a very loud bram, which is similar to like a trombone or French horn sound that's really aggressive. It's an aggressive brass element in the bass. Think Hans Zimmer. But the thing is, like, I don't use that element at all until we hit the climax of the songs, which is usually in the final chorus. There are also a few instrumentals that I use it as well, but again, those are supposed to really hit hard, and it's supposed to come across like this is the biggest moment of the song. So even though the remainder of the arrangement is actually quite similar, I'm using very similar instruments, dynamics are kind of similar, the difference is in one sound. That actually adds an incredible amount of energy. Now the average listener, they're not gonna know what that thing is. They're not even gonna know what I did. They're not gonna be sitting here thinking, oh wow, you added a bram, right? But they're gonna feel it. Now let's just say you make EDM, which is often not as overall dynamic. I'm not saying EDM isn't dynamic, by the way. Don't come after me. Obviously, it can be. But just generally speaking, EDM is going to have a little bit of a more narrow threshold in their dynamics. So instead, you might be using extra bits of percussion to add a bit more juice to the climax, using toppers and shakers and tambos and things like that. Okay, maybe not tambos and EDM, but I think you get the point. Or perhaps you use some saturation to the bass so it has more impact. And obviously, saturation is a mixed choice, not an arrangement choice, but I think you can understand the point here. The point here is that you might be using more subtle pieces of arrangement to actually accomplish that. The choices themselves can be more subtle, but you still need to be thinking about how to make the climax truly feel like the moment that everything is leading up to. It could be in the vocal production by adding a bit more vocal layers or harmony. It might be a single element that adds that 5% extra bump of energy. So you don't need to be going for like these enormous differences. Again, you gotta trust your ears in a lot of ways. Just being aware of this is gonna help you to hear it. Now, what about quieter songs? Even those songs that are quieter still have a climax, but again, it's in proportion to the rest. You need to understand that dynamic arrangements are all about context. Without context, you have nothing to ultimately anchor your ear to know what a baseline of the dynamics is. Like if you just picked a random song and started listening in the middle of the song and it's super loud, that's a lot different than starting at the beginning when it's a lot more quiet, or vice versa. Because if you were to start in the middle of the song and it's very loud, that's your baseline now. And so if you just listen through the rest of the song, you might think, well, this isn't very dynamic. But if you listen to the start of the song all the way through, your ears are picking up the context of the entirety of the song, and the dynamics flow through the song. So again, think of the flow of the song from start to finish and make sure you save it for the climax and you plan it so that the moment it is biggest, it doesn't feel like an afterthought. I'm a big fan of being intentional with your music. In other words, don't do things by accident. When you're making decisions and doing things, actually think about, what am I doing here? What's the purpose of what I'm doing here? And am I actually thinking about this, or am I just kind of throwing paint on the wall? By the way, I'm not saying throwing the paint on the wall cannot make for some happy accidents. It sure can. Number 5, spread out your chords. I'm gonna hop on the piano to explain this to you. This right here is hopefully gonna blow your mind. When you think of notes, notes obviously go from low to high. So obviously on a piano, from the left to the right, you've got the super low notes, and on the right-hand side, you've got all the really high notes. So this idea of going from the left to the right, or from the lows to the highs, this is known as vertical spacing. So how are you stacking your notes on top of each other vertically? Are you using close voicings like this, where literally every single note in the triad or in that chord is actually next to each other? Or are you using more spread out voicings like this? Obviously, I can't play all of that with one hand or two hands, but what I'm doing here is an octave in the bass. This is a C, a C, a G, an E, a G, and a C. This is a lot more spread out. So closed voicings are when the notes are very close in proximity to each other vertically. Again, this is... And this can obviously sound really amazing. It especially sounds really good on the piano. This sounds really good in string writing, for example. But the problem that I see is that more often than not, amateur producers end up overloading their voicings in the same ranges, and they're not spreading out their chords vertically amongst different instruments. In other words, if your guitar is in this range here, but so is the piano, and so is the synth, and so is, whatever the other instruments are that you have, then guess what? That sounds like crap. And again, what blows my mind is how many people will say things like, just use EQ to carve this out, instead of just fix your arrangement. And I can tell you, by the way, that professional mix engineers hate it when producers send them productions that are like this, where everything is stacked up in the middle and everything is on top of each other. Like if you're a mixing engineer that mixes clients that's watching this video, just drop a comment and let people know how much this sucks to work with, because it really sucks to work with. So instead of doing that, you can leverage your notes vertically to carve out space for instruments. So I want you to think about the vertical space of pitch as individual pockets for instruments to exist. So your keys might be hanging out in here. Your guitar might be voiced a little higher. It's a little out of tune, it's winter. And the synth could be even higher. And so we now have individual pockets. And the cool thing is as you spread things out, it actually creates space for them to exist within the context of the arrangement. Now this does two things at the same time. The first is that you've carved out space in the harmony for these instruments to exist, which means that they won't be crowding each other, which also makes mixing a lot easier, by the way. And second, by doing this, each instrument is going to be heard better. You can change which instruments exist where throughout the song. Like for example, the piano is obviously an instrument that can play a huge range of notes. I'm often going to use the higher register of the piano in different sections of the song, and perhaps use the lower register of the piano in other sections of the song, and then I'll interchange what instruments are happening. This also helps keep things interesting. But if you are stacking all of your instruments on top of each other and you're not thinking of how these notes are spaced out vertically, it's very often likely going to be a really muddy arrangement. I have a whole lesson on this idea of vertical stacking in my new arrangement module in Producer Accelerator that I go into more depth than I can go into this video, so you should definitely check that out. And there are 100% times, by the way, that you want to overlap your instruments in the same register. There are times where if you're using like a synth and a guitar in the same range, the guitar is tonally adding a different characteristic than the synth is. So I'm not saying don't ever do this. Don't go in the comments and say Nathan said that you can never layer instruments. That's not what I'm saying. Again, revert back to the layering idea that we talked about earlier in this video. The point I'm trying to make here is that if everything is happening in that exact same space, that's when you start running into problems. And when you start putting everything in the same range like that, that's when producers inevitably start thinking, maybe I just need to use EQ more. Which leads me to say, a lot of the problems that producers have are not mixing problems. I'm not saying that you don't have any mixing problems. I'm not suggesting that mixing issues are not an important thing to tackle. They certainly are, but we need to make sure that we put in place what things are the real problems and then what things might be secondary problems. A lot of these issues are arrangement problems. So use these tips to start fixing those issues first and then tackle the mixing issues second. Separation is one of the most powerful tools we as producers can use in arrangement. Now, what is separation? Separation is just simply how we differentiate one element from another. And one of the most powerful ways of doing this is utilizing what's called vertical space. Whoa, Nathan. Separation, differentiation, vertical space. What are we talking about right now? Gotta put you down here. Let me explain vertical space first. If you think about pitch, pitch works from low notes, very deep, all the way up to the high notes, very high. And every instrument has this. Every instrument has a specific range. Obviously the piano has 88 different notes that we can use. Guitar has, I have no idea how many notes guitar has. A lot of notes, many octaves it can play. And what so many music producers do, and not just producers, but just arrangers and composers too, is they write and create in such a way where they essentially compress vertical space. So vertical space is simply from the low notes to the high notes, how much space is in between. So if I play a note way down here, and then a note way up here, there's a huge amount of space in between. This is known as vertical space, and we can actually fill this space inwards. And that right there fills up a decent amount of space vertically. Now, obviously, I'm doing this just on a piano, a single instrument. Now, here's what happens. What happens is a ton of producers write and they work and they arrange and produce in such a way where they compress the vertical space. In other words, they squeeze things down and they put things in a small amount of vertical space in terms of pitches, right? So you think about like a guitar, maybe you got like a chord, let's just say a power chord, something like that. But then you put your piano in here too. And then you put like a synth in here too. And then you put a whatever in here too, right? Whatever the instrument is. And by compressing this and putting a bunch of instruments in that same exact space in terms of pitch, you have as a result compressed the vertical space. And this is why so many producers have super messy sounding arrangements that don't work. All right, so how do we fix this? You do this, don't worry, we're gonna step over to the computer and I'm gonna actually show you some examples of doing this bad and some examples of how we can fix this literally immediately. So conceptually, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are strategically placing your instruments and your sounds and your elements within the actual production itself vertically in a way that is strategic. Sometimes you do want sounds to be in the exact same vertical space, like this right here is an octave and a third. So if I have a chord progression like this, and then it, repeats or whatever, if I have the piano in this range here, and then I also have the guitar in this range, and then the synth in this range, and any other number of instruments in this range, that might end up sounding a little bit too messy, too muddy, like there's not enough happening. But if instead we start spreading this out, where maybe the piano's here, then you put the guitar up here, and then you put something else up here, and then you put something else up here, then all of a sudden you're actually expanding that vertical space. Part of our jobs as producers and as writers and composers, arrangers, is to be strategic and think through, how do I want to actually utilize all of this space that I have in terms of the pitches themselves? And in a lot of cases, we want to compress vertical space. In other words, you want to use a relatively narrow amount of space because that can actually make things feel a certain way, whether that's smaller or whether it just kind of makes something feel a little bit more dense in the middle or wherever it is that you're putting it. But a really crazy thing happens when you're talking about writing and you're utilizing vertical space is that the more you spread things out, the bigger it sounds, and also the more differentiated it sounds. So if I put my strings up higher and then I have my piano down here and then maybe like a synth in the mid-range, I'm now leveraging the entirety of this vertical space in a way that sounds a lot more interesting. Yes, I know you're probably bored with that by now. Let's actually show some real examples here. Now, before we actually jump in here, I do just want to say I'm laying out more of a framework here. I'm not making black and white statements. I'm not even laying out any rules. I'm trying to give you something and a basis to think about when you're making music because, like I said, there are times where you want to compress things, you want things in the same range, and then there are other times where you want to spread things out, and I'm trying to more or less help you actually strategically think about this because if you don't have any intention behind it, that's when you have problems. Okay, so what I have here is literally the most basic chord progression you could ever have is minor progression in the piano. It's C minor, A flat major, E flat major, and then a B flat major. Now, I'm gonna be using literally the most basic instruments ever because that's all I need to do to demonstrate this. I'm gonna use electric piano, guitar, synth, piano, and strings, and bass. So with this chord progression in the piano, we are literally hovering right in the mid-range. So what I'm gonna demonstrate now is just by adding in some electric piano, just like this. In the exact same range as the piano. And I really want you to pay attention just with the piano and just with the electric piano, which are somewhat similar instruments. Just listen to how this sounds. This doesn't sound bad, right? But what I'm gonna do now is add in some guitar. Of course, this isn't like a real guitar. This is a Native Instruments guitar. It doesn't sound terrible, but it could sound better. I'm gonna put it in the exact same range. Okay, hopefully immediately you're noticing. This is not sounding great. You can understand the point. Some people might say you can just change the stereo field. In my opinion, that doesn't really fix the problem when really the problem is that everything is existing in the exact same vertical space. So in other words, we've compressed the vertical space. What I want you to really listen to is just the piano and the electric piano. It doesn't actually sound bad. But it's when we add that guitar, all of a sudden, by adding 3 instruments in that range that are all different instruments, now all of a sudden our ears are kind of like, something sounds a little funky here, right? And so hopefully this can help you just hear that and then be aware of it, that when you're working, when you start noticing, hey, I have a lot of things happening in the same range, that might not be a good thing, right? That might be something you should just take a look at and say, hey, does this actually sound good or not? But what happens if the only thing we do is we just bump the guitar up an octave? I'm not gonna change anything else, but we're just gonna expand the vertical space. We're now gonna extend it by an octave. Now Now the sounds in this whole thing sound like crap, right? This is not like a pro sounding production by any stretch of the imagination, nor is it meant to be. It's meant to be an example here so I can teach you something. And I can just show you just by the chords alone, that makes a really helpful difference. But what I want to show you now is what happens if we take this guitar and we try to do something melodic or maybe more of a pattern. Right? Something a little bit more like an arpeggio, right? But we're gonna do it in the exact same range. So we're no longer adding these low notes, right? Which is part of the problem because they're low and they're now causing conflict. Instead, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add something in the mid range. This is right around the middle C range with the guitar, doing kind of a similar thing as the piano. All right, I'm actually gonna add a little bit of reverb on here just to make it sound a little bit better. All right, so let's listen to the sounds like now. Now, this does not sound terrible, right? But listen to how much more interesting this is and how much it actually stands out to your ear. I'm not changing the volume, I'm not automating anything. The only thing I'm doing is increasing the octave. I'm gonna put it up an octave. Okay, so hopefully you can just understand that the only thing I'm doing is just changing where things happen vertically in terms of the amount of pitches we have to use. We are given a lot of different pitches to use. Let's actually use them. Now what's crazy is that if I bump this up an octave even more, that to me stands out even more. The guitar is standing out above, obviously in a very literal sense, above the rest. But what's happening to me now is the separation between that guitar and everything else is now a 2-octave separation. There's now 2 octaves. So there's a lot of space in between that is not being utilized now. So what do we do with that space? And so this is where thinking about vertical space when it comes to arrangement is so helpful, because if you have a lot of stuff here, kind of in the low mid range, and then a lot of stuff up here in the kind of higher range, and then nothing in the high mids, we'll call it, guess what? You're gonna almost feel this hole. There's something missing there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna fill that out with strings. I'm just gonna use a very sustained kind of very simple. Let's add some reverb on that, make it sound a little better. Now let's listen to how this sounds. Guess what? Obviously we have another sound, so sonically we hear a unique sound in terms of timbre because the strings sound different. However, by filling that space and putting something in the range that we had a gap in, we're actually expanding this to where now, hey, the guitar is sitting up here, the strings are here, and the piano and the electric piano are down here, and now we have more or less a pocket of where different instruments are supposed to be. And then listen to what happens when we add the bass. When we add that low end, all of a sudden it feels like it's been completely rounded out. Look at that, all of a sudden we have only 5 instruments that sound relatively full. Is this what I would actually want to do in an arrangement? No, probably not. But the point here is that simple arrangements, even like this, where you've literally got like some chords, a little arpeggiate thing, and then like chords, and then just the bass, that can sound pretty rich. Now, this is with everything right down the middle. There's no panning happening, so if you wanted to carve it out even further, great, you can do that. But I'm saying that you can actually create separation, which is what we talked about at the very beginning of this video, simply by changing where in terms of the vertical space things happen. If you put everything in the same octave, if you put everything too close in timbre, in register, then you are more likely going to have problems. And again, none of this is a rule, none of this is like, do as I say or else. You need to use your ears when you're actually doing this. I'm trying to give you something that if you are playing with something, if you're arranging something, you're thinking, wow, this sounds a little messy, I'm just giving you something to look at and hopefully you can tackle. And you can take this very concept and you can leverage it and utilize it in really, really, really creative ways. So Have fun.
If arrangement has ever confused you, one song feels too empty, the next song feels too cluttered. I'm gonna show you how I approach arrangement in a way that could change how you make music forever. I know this works because I've taught it to students inside of our producer development program, and for many of them, it's been a complete light bulb moment. And I think it will be for you too. So let's not waste any time and dive right in. When we think about building a song, most producers start listing things like vocals, drums, bass, guitar, maybe some keys, and that's all fine, but the real power comes when you shift how you think about those elements. I want to introduce you to something I call the 3-stack rule. Here's the idea. At any given moment in a song, you can have up to 3 musical ideas happening that pull the listener's attention. These are not background textures or foundational layers. These are actual elements the ear can easily pick out and follow. When you add more than that, your song starts to feel cluttered, confusing, or overwhelming. Now, don't worry, I'm gonna show you exactly what I mean with examples in just a minute. But before we do that, we need to zoom out to make sure we're on the same page. Music is ultimately made up of individual components that all serve a purpose. And when it comes to arrangement, your job isn't just to stack cool sounds on top of each other. It's to understand the function of each part. Take drums. You can beatbox a groove, and that rhythm certainly carries the song, but no one walks away humming a kick pattern. Same goes for bass. Might have a really great groove, but it's not usually the part you're singing. Chords, sure, they give harmonic context, but again, not melodic. You're not humming the chord progression in the shower. So when I say singable, I mean melodic or attention-grabbing material. These are hooks, lines, counter melodies. These are catchy riffs, the things that's earworms. So what does that tell us? It tells us that every element in your track has a job to do, and as a producer, you need to understand and respect those roles. Now here's where people often get it wrong. They'll think, okay, drums are one idea, bass is another, chords, that's the third, right? That's the 3, right? The 3-stack rule. But no, we're not counting the foundation. Drums, bass, chords, that's your base layer. This is the support structure. The 3-stack rule applies to what is built on top of that. And that's where most producers start running into problems. In the songs I work on with my students, they often do have a solid foundation. They have the drums, bass, and chords, they're all working together, but the track still feels bland or it feels chaotic. And the issue is almost always the same. It's the layers on top that aren't being managed with intention. So this question becomes, what 3 items are leading at this moment in the song? Not just what sounds are playing, but which ones are competing for attention? And how do we arrange them so that one track feels full, exciting, and emotionally clear without turning into a mess? So let's take a look at some real examples so you can see exactly how this works and how you can apply it in your own music. I have a project open here. We're gonna just jump straight into it. There's a lot going on. As you can see, there's over 100 tracks total, but I've consolidated things down into groups so that way it's a little bit easier to digest. But what I wanna do is actually play this chorus for you so you can get an idea of what's happening. And this is the final chorus, so keep in mind we're not having all the context leading into this, but really pay attention to what's actually happening across the board between the foundational layers all the way up into the melody with the vocals and what some of these other melodic instruments are doing. Here we go.
I'm lost, searching all around. I know I can't be found. I'm lost, too lost inside my mind. I know I'm trying to find.
This is the big moment of the song. But what I want to do is kind of show you what I mean when I talk about foundational layers first that we are not including in these 3 items that we're talking about on top of first. The first thing would be obviously the bass and percussion, which sounds like this. Now, obviously this is cool, it's working great, it's got a nice vibe to it, but again, this is not something that you're gonna be walking away singing, right? One of the other things that I have in here that would be considered foundational would be some of these synth elements that we have here that I recorded with this analog synth. So again, this is playing a foundational role. And so when we put all of these together, just the foundation between the bass, the synth, and the percussion, we have something that sounds good, but this isn't quite enough. Okay, so now we have to start building things on top of this. So this is where the 3-stack rule comes into play. We can have 3 things happening on top of what I have here at the maximum. Now, I am gonna show you in this very song examples of when there's only 1 thing happening, because there does not always need to be 3 things happening. So what I don't want you to take away from this video is, Nathan said there needs to be 3 things happening all the time, so therefore I'm just gonna have 3 things happening all the time. That actually makes for boring arrangements too, because then it's too much all the time. So I'm starting at the big moment here so that I can backtrack and show you the smaller moments and how we actually develop this over time. Okay, so when we talk about 3 individual things that can happen, the very first and most obvious thing is the vocal melodies. So the vocal itself is the first. So let's take a listen to how this sounds just with the foundation.
I'm lost, searching all around. I know I can't be found.
Now that obviously is working well because we have this nice vocal melody and then we have the foundation, but it is still feeling a little bit too empty for the big moment of the song, right? Like we need more than just this. And so this is oftentimes where I get a lot of producers that this is where their song is. And they're like, I don't understand why it doesn't sound very good. It's like, well, you have the melody, you have the chords, you have bass, you have percussion, but you actually have room for 2 additional elements that you can put in here that make it really, really interesting. And by the way, this is where it gets fun and creative, because we can have all sorts of ideas and there's about 1,000 different ways that you would approach the same song. So the very first thing that we have in here is this idea in the piano. And this is incredibly simple. This is a very, very simple dun, 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 dun. Now that works great. And so what I'm actually doing within the arrangement itself, because again, some of you might be looking at this saying, oh my gosh, Nathan, there's 123 tracks in here. How does that work? Well, how that works is I actually take that one idea, which is, well, we're gonna say that's idea number 2. This is thing 2, melody 2. This is counter melody number 2, right? Or counter melody number 1, but idea number 2. And what I'm doing is I'm actually taking this melody, I'm gonna put it in other places within the song that becomes sonically a little bit more interesting and intriguing. So where I end up putting it in is the strings as well. So we have a bunch of live strings here, and then I also have my virtual strings here as well, which is a little secret tip that I do to make really, really big sounding strings. And so if I just do this, you'll find that, oh, this is actually a singable melody. Now, you could actually walk away from here and say, I can sing that melody. Da, right? That's an actual counter melody that we have here. So what happens when we take that counter melody that I just sang for you and just played for you, and then put that within the context of the vocals and the foundation? Let's take a listen to how that sounds now.
I'm lost, searching all around. I know I can't be found. I'm lost.
Now this is actually working really, really well. And you can tell this isn't too much for our ear to handle. Our ear can actually make sense of this. We're hearing the melody, we're hearing the counter melody, and then everything else essentially holding the fort down within the base layers of the foundation that we have. And our brains are able to pick it all out. Now, is the average listener gonna hear this and literally be walking away singing every single one of these things? No, but the brain can still comprehend it without it becoming too confusing. And this is also where we're starting to add nuance and richness into the song. And again, I want to make it very, very clear. This is not the only counter melody you could come up with. You might come up with a completely different idea than I'll come up with, and that's the beauty of making art. Okay, so we have 2 ideas so far, but you might notice this isn't quite how it actually ended up sounding when I played it for you. So where is that 3rd idea coming from? And this is what brings us to the cello part mixed with the viola. And so this is obviously a really beautiful part. I mean, this is actually singable. It's got a melodic component to it, even though it's actually kind of outlining the chords. And so what happens when we take all of this and put it together now.
I'm lost, searching all around. I know I can't be found. I'm lost, too lost inside my mind.
And this is also what makes an instrumental feel very, very interesting, where the instrumental feels like it can actually stand on its own. Because if we take out the vocals, there's enough happening, there's enough bones, there's enough structure to the instrumental itself that this instrumental is really interesting. So take this, use it in your own music. Now, there is an arrangement technique that I didn't have time to get into in this video that will help make sure your arrangements sound massive without sounding too boxed in or too cluttered. That'll take you even further when you tie it together with what we talked about in this video. So that's where you need to go next to keep improving your arrangements right here.